Hi, thanks for joining me for this mock feedback and lecture that I hope will be helpful and relevant to those of you listening. Having quite a few technological issues today, so I'm hoping this works, but sorry if it's a bit glitchy as we go through. So your mock paper included a mock assessing the education topic, and within that you had questions on the theory of education and the role of education, and then a section on educational policy. Okay, so what I've done is I have thought about what were the main issues or errors that came up in the different questions, and what I would suggest you do is that you have a look at your mock paper, which should be in front of you, and you've hopefully got a different colour pen, and you identify which questions you want to look at first. So perhaps the ones that you did less well on, start off those ones, rather than perhaps spending ages improving a 4-marker. It might be worth spending a lot longer looking at the 10-mark questions, for example. So you can skip backwards and forwards in this lecture. You do not need to listen to the whole lecture if you've done quite well in one of the questions, for example. And there were 6 questions in total. So getting started, number 1 on the theory, the question was outline 2 criticisms of schools selecting pupils by ability. This was a 4-mark question. Now, the main problem with this question was lots of you didn't interpret the question correctly. Selecting pupils by ability is when schools select after a selection test or an entrance test. Okay, so you needed to write about actual selection by ability, and the most famous entrance exam, of course, is the 11 plus. Okay, although some other schools, particularly private schools, will use some selection tests as well. Now, lots of you wrote about schools selecting based on perceived high ability. I don't get me wrong, we have talked a lot about covert selection in class, the idea that schools will pick what they think are the high ability students, more white, more middle class, more girls, because we know that they'll do better in in exams and improve their league table position. But this question was asking you to think about schools selecting pupils by actual ability in terms of ability tests. I did accept some good points on one of the issues, one of the criticisms of selecting pupils by ability was that the other schools got left with a low ability, leading to inequality. And in some cases, I gave credit if you'd made a point about those who are materially deprived will do less well. Obviously, that is true for the 11 plus, but I wouldn't have probably given you the full 2 marks at that point. I would have only given you 1. So in terms of how it's marked, you'll see a 1 for the correct point and then a +1 for the development. Okay, so if you look at the mark scheme, what they were looking for was really thinking about the problems of the 11 plus, to be honest with you. So firstly, some pupils are late developers, 1 mark. So selecting at the age of 11 means that students who develop later are at a disadvantage, another mark. Selection may benefit the middle class children, 1 mark, but then explain why. Because middle class parents can provide tutors and coaching for their children, so they will do well in tests. You could have also said selection may benefit middle class children, because if you look at the very bottom bullet point there, tests might be culturally biased, the language used might be biased against working class and minority ethnic groups, so that's making the point about the culturally biased tests. You could have made this point, although no one did. There are difficulties in measuring ability, 1 mark, IQ tests only measure one aspect of ability, and they're notoriously inaccurate. And then you could have also said testing may result in lower self-esteem for children, 1 mark, as those that fail may feel stigmatised and may end up attending poorer schools and doing less well because they perhaps form anti-school subcultures. And I would have credited any other relevant points. But yeah, this question was not answered very well because lots of you misunderstood what it meant by selecting pupils by ability. It's using selection tests. Number 2 on the theory part of the paper was Outline 3 functions that the education system performs for society. A nice, clear theory question here, like what does education do for society? Now, the issues and errors that came up were making the same point twice, or only making 2 points and no third. So there seemed to be a bit of an issue of not being aware of 3 functions of the education system. Many of you only seem to be aware of 2, or could only write about 2. So one that came up quite often in terms of making the same point twice was saying, on one point was like, setting and streaming means the working class get low paid work, and which is role allocation. And then you do another point saying, the middle class get filtered into good jobs because they go into top sets. That's basically the same point, so I can't give you this credit twice, but I'd have credited the stronger one. Quite a number of you wrote about or tried to make the point about schools teaching shared values, which is great. That's the secondary socialisation. But lots of you said that schools teach that everyone is equal. That's not true. That's incorrect. Schools teach, if you like, that inequality is inevitable based on meritocracy. So just be mindful of that knowledge error. Lots of you did mention the point of schools create social solidarity, but you weren't able to explain how. So that's the first bullet point in the mark scheme. Through the teaching of history and culture, school helps create a shared sense of identity. You could have also said putting students into tutor groups or year groups also helps create that shared sense of identity. Some were just really poorly explained, so I'd given you the point for identifying, yes, the function of education, but I wouldn't have given you credit for the explanation because it was so weak and vague. However, this question was generally answered well, okay, overall. So just talking through the mark scheme with you. I've talked to you about the social solidarity one already. Teaching specialist work skills, 1 mark. In a society with a complex division of labour, this meets the needs of economy. So, if any of you wrote a point about creating a skilled workforce for the benefit of the economy, creating good human capital through teaching skills to help the economy, you had to make a link, a bit clear about what is it that schools or education does to help the economy. You couldn't just be like, it creates human capital for the economy. You just kind of need to add a bit more depth to that. I wouldn't have given a full 2 marks for an answer like that. Secondary socialisation, I've mentioned briefly, 1 mark. Schools are socialising agencies and teach shared norms and values and behaviour to children, another mark. You could have also said the hidden curriculum is there to socialise students to the norms and values expected in the workplace. You could have also had a point on the hidden curriculum teaches students to listen, to take orders, to respect hierarchy for the workplace. Role allocation came up lots, which is great. Selecting children for the most appropriate occupations based on meritocratic principles. But just like I said before, be aware some of you tried to make that point twice, said, the working class are allocated into low-paid jobs because they fail at school because of setting and streaming. And then you would have done another point saying, but the middle class end up in top-paid jobs because they benefit from positive labelling and good setting and streaming. It's the same point twice, so you don't even credit for it once. A point on reproducing class inequality, and there's different explanations for that. So again, you talked about differences in cultural capital, means that certain students, middle class students, will do better than working class. Differences in economic capital will also do the same. Talk about teacher labelling against the working class being put in lower sets. All of those lead to the reproduction of class inequality. So again, that explanation needs to be there for the additional mark. And I don't think I saw anyone make a point about patriarchy. One of the functions of education system is to reproduce or reinforce patriarchy, 1 mark. So you could have talked about processes such as labelling and differences in subject choice lead to gender inequality in schools. You could have talked about the uniform policy, would have been a good one, which reinforces the idea that girls are sexual objects to be objectified, which is part of patriarchy. And I would have credited any other good points that I read. Okay, so that one was out of 6. So number 3 in the theory section was your first 10-mark question. And what I've done there in this slide is I've explained my annotations, which were in green. So this, if any of you are sat there going, I don't know what that means, what on earth is that scroll referring to? Hopefully this will help clear some things up. So I will have, just so H for hook, WH is a weak hook or implicit hook, so it's not very clear. I will have written next to each point, whether it was point 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4. Some of you accidentally, I think, made more than 1 point in each section. Some of you used more than one hook in each section of the essay. So I had to try and pick out where one point sort of finished and another point began. We mark very positively when that does happen. If I notice you, say, start point 1 and then you drift into a second point, but then drift back to the original point 1, I will credit the point 1 aspects of that paragraph and look at point 2 separately, so that you can get the maximum marks if you like. And next to wherever I've written a P1, P2, P3, whatever, I will have hopefully written what explanation you've gone for that point. Okay, so I've made a note of what explanation you're using, just to make sure you don't explain the same point twice. So then, of course, after I've identified whether you've got a hook, I'll be marking the quality of the explanation. Is it explained well or just explained? Or UDW would have been undeveloped or weak explanation, so that's not so great. AN is great, it's analysis in terms of your quality of explanation. And of course, you need app, you need your clear application, okay, which in this case is you're asked to analyse 2 ways in which the education system might serve the needs of capitalism. So you have to clearly explain the point that you made, how it has served capitalism. W app is weak application. Any of you that did evaluation, so evaluation applied, evaluation clearly applied to the question, which is good. Evaluation no applied or not applied, not applied, so not credited, not helpful. So, the common issues, and in top I've got the main issue there, was not using the correct hooks, and using a hook and then not explaining it. So just sticking a hook in and then drifting off into a completely different explanation. Okay, so from the item there were 3 main hooks you could have used. Okay, 3 main hooks. And what I've done on this slide is I've talked through how I would have used those hooks to develop a point around what education does to benefit capitalism. Okay. So you could have used, this is one of the more difficult hooks to use, so those of you that did, well done. Whether you did it well, it's another matter, unfortunately. Capitalism is based on the ownership of the means of production. Therefore, your point, you'd have had to explain how education ensures the bourgeoisie or the middle class or the rich, how is it that education makes sure that they leave school successful enough to continue the ownership of the means of production, okay? So that would have been looking at processes like labelling, setting and streaming, how their cultural and economic capital gave them an unfair advantage above other students, okay? And effectively, that point is role allocation. You're arguing that schools make sure the rich do well and get into the top paid jobs for this reason, okay? So if you have made that point, you've just got to make sure that one of your other points is not also a point on role allocation. Forced to undertake low-paid alienating work to survive. It was a really good hook to use. There's lots of things you could have said about that. So what is it that schools do that mean that when young people leave school, working class students leave school, they take those low-paid jobs and they put up with how crap they are, basically. So you could have used a few different explanations here. So you could talk about how schools label, they set and stream working class students, so they end up failing. So as a result, they've got no choice but to take those low-paid jobs. That's role allocation. If you've already done a point in role allocation, you can only do it once. And then this idea that schools teach that failure is self-inflicted through the myth of meritocracy. So they take those low-paid jobs unquestioningly, and that's part of ideological control. So that's a slightly different explanation there, okay? You're saying, yeah, they take those low-paid jobs, but they don't argue about it because they believe they deserve them. Use of Paul Willis there would have been good. But that's ideological control. That's controlling how they think. And finally, some of you did really good points on the hidden curriculum creates a docile workforce, okay, that puts up with low-paid, alienating work, which is preparation for work, okay? So slightly different explanation, preparing them for work. Fits in slightly with ideological control, but if you argued it in a different way, I could credit it twice. And then the final hook, most of you did use, capitalism depends on the proletariat not overthrowing the system. So here you need to explain what is it that education does that means that when young people leave school, they don't try and immediately overthrow the unfairness of capitalism. Well, it's the ideological control again. Schools teach students that failure is self-inflicted. Meritocracy is true, so if they fail, it's because they haven't worked hard enough. It's not the rich's fault, okay, that they've failed and they're not doing well. So as a result, they don't question their position in society. And so that is a mixture of both ideological control and, I guess, role allocation. And again, you could have talked about the hidden curriculum here for this hook as well. You could have said how schools socialise students to accept hierarchy and to take commands and exploitation through the hidden curriculum, which again is ideological control. So quite a lot to take in there, and I've talked for ages about this question. One of the biggest issues with this question, apart from not using the right hooks or really struggling to explain the hook that you chose, was then forgetting to apply back to the question, how each of the above benefits capitalism, and that's the language I was looking for, like how does it serve capitalism, how does it help the rich stay rich? If you've got a hook, if the hook is missing or the application is missing, the entire point is useless. Again, if the explanation that you've written is not in any way connected to the hook that you've used, that point becomes useless, so I won't have credited it. So look out for my annotations where I've got a summary of how I've marked each point at the end. You'll be able to see if any of those things are missing, like if it says no hook, no app, explanation not linked, that means that entire point will have been pretty much useless. And if that's happened twice, the most you can get is 3. Now this is quite common, the error of this question, and this happened when I marked it, when it was done for an exam a number of years ago. If you made the same point twice, I credited the strongest. So if you did do 2 points on ideological control, or you did do 2 points on effectively how schools allocate students into low-paid jobs and the rich into high-paid jobs, that's 2 points in role allocation, I will have credited the strongest one. Or I will have taken aspects of each paragraph to make one big point, if you like. So just be aware and have a look at what my annotations say next to each of your paragraphs, so I've worked out which explanations you've gone for, because a number of you did explain the same point twice. Okay, so that's the end of the theory section, and that bit was out of 20. Okay. So, I'm going to talk to you now about the educational policy section, and then I'll talk to you about overall grades at the very end when we're in class, hopefully. So the first question, educational policy, was outline 2 reasons why marketisation policies may produce inequality of educational achievement between social classes. So common errors here. Lots of you wrote far too much for this question, which reduced the amount of time you have for your 10 marker. Other issues were that there wasn't really a clear marketisation policy or effect of marketisation identified. Some of you incorrectly talked about comprehensives, the tripartite system. They are not marketisation policies. Some of you did discuss, I've mentioned it below, privatisation policies, which include academies as well. So remember, academies are evidence of privatisation, unless you made the link to academies creating more competition in the education marketplace. Again, this issue of making the same point twice. So say you've written a point saying working class parents make bad choices because of lack of capital, and then you've done a second point saying but middle class parents make good choices because of their good capital. They are the same. That's the same argument. It's his argument that capital is affecting the type of school that students end up in, and therefore that would widen the social class gap if the middle class students are going to the good schools and the working class the bad schools. You did need to really clearly explain why it creates inequality between the classes. So lots of you mentioned good points or good issues with marketisation, but you didn't then explain how it then created the inequality. Other good points that I credited that was not on the mark screen was tuition fees, but you have to explain, okay, that tuition fees mean that the working class were less likely to apply because they're put off by debt. Obviously, the student loan system's there to compensate for that, but they still don't want to necessarily walk away with 27 grand plus worth of debt. You could have made a point about league tables and Ofsted reports being difficult for the working class to understand because of a lack of educational capital. And another point about league tables, because it's a different development, so I would have credited it, means that those schools at the top get more funding and they can pay for better resources, while those at the bottom, mainly working class students, get less funding and poorer resources and poorer teaching standards. This was generally answered fairly well, apart from those of you that just sort of misunderstood what a marketisation policy was. Okay, so I'm not going to read through that mark scheme with you because I've sort of alluded to those already. But yeah, have a look at that mark scheme, be aware of the other points you could have included. Okay, I was really impressed by the number of you that have used the argument that successful schools used covert selection to select middle class students more than working class because they believed they were high achievers. So I was really impressed by the number of you that remembered that point. Number 2 for educational policy section was outline 3 examples of ways in which government policies may have reduced social inequalities in educational achievement. Okay, so this is looking at compensatory policies. So I'll just jump straight in with the common errors. Common errors, no clear policy was identified. Okay, so you didn't actually talk about an educational policy. Some of you talked about setting and streaming, and that's not a policy, for example, that's the effect of a policy like league tables. Or some of you, I correctly identified a policy but didn't tell me what type of social inequality the policy reduced. You had to tell me. And obviously it says social inequalities, that you could talk about class, gender or ethnicity, although most of you did focus on class. Some got EMA mixed up with aim higher, so education maintenance allowance is for college level education, or what's known as further education, money to pay directly to students for books and travel so they could go to college to do A-levels. Aim higher is an aspirational policy aimed at getting more working class students to think about going to university, as well as helping them financially with open days, attending open days. So aim higher was aimed at getting more into uni. EMA was aimed at getting more into further education, the A-levels. A number of you used GIST and WISE, like girls into science and technology, for example. Unfortunately, those policies were much more about getting more girls to pick male-dominated subjects. It was more about subject choice. And it wasn't really about the inequality in educational achievement, which is what the question's asking you. Now, some of you did manage to argue that this then increased girls' achievement in those subject areas, and I did allow that because you had connected it to achievement. But those of you that didn't make that clear reference, I wasn't able to credit it, unfortunately. A couple of you used coursework as a policy, but actually coursework really didn't increase the inequalities. Coursework didn't really reduce inequalities. It actually increased them, if you like, because girls did so much better at it. You could have used the removal of coursework possibly, okay, because that reduced the inequality in educational achievement as boys then did better because it was more exam-based assessment. Lots of you referred to Sure Start, but didn't really explain it too well. So just to remind you that Sure Start centres were set up in areas of deprivation around the country, like little community centres, where young parents could take their kids and they could, talk to health visitors about healthy diets. They could get health checks for their kids to make sure they're developing correctly. They could get advice about games to play at home and activities they should be doing. And the young people, the kids, got to play with educational toys as well. So it was very much making up for a lack of educational socialisation and a lack of maybe value for education in the home. But it was also linked slightly to economic capital because, maybe these parents couldn't afford some of those educational toys, so they were able to play with educational toys, which clearly cost money, which meant that when those young people started school, they were on a much more even footing with maybe young people from middle class backgrounds who would have had an educational socialisation when they were younger. Other good points not on the mark scheme was aim higher, more working class at uni as increased aspirations, and also progress 8 means that the progress of all children mattered. Okay, so working class and Afro-Caribbean students would no longer be abandoned in lower sets. I'm not going to read through the entire mark scheme with you because I think it's pretty clear. Again, it's just making sure. Oh, sorry, one other policy that I've not put on the PowerPoint that was good to talk about was the old academy systems, which was set up to help failing schools that had mainly working class students. So the extra funding and resources allocated would have benefited working class students, therefore reducing the inequality between them and because of the school they attended, and the more middle class schools at the top of the league table. So that was another point that you could have talked about. So have a read through the mark scheme, have a think about any errors that you made, and add some improvements. So your last question was a 10 marker, and I think all of you had a go at this one, which was great. And that's exactly the same annotations as for the theory question. So have a look at those annotations. Hopefully that helps you understand what I've scrawled on the side of your paper. If you still have some issues understanding what I've said, please just let me know if I'm in class with you. Right. So, with this question, which was applying material from item A, analyse 2 effects of increased parental choice on pupils' experience of education. And well done. Lots of you recognise that parental choice is basically marketisation, but there are other aspects to it as well. However, the main issue with this question was not using the correct hooks, or having a hook but then not writing about it correctly. And this is the big one, not actually applying what you said back to the point on pupils' experiences of education. So what actually happened to pupils when they were in schools because of the hook that you used. So I've written quite a lot for this one, so apologies it's a bit small. So the hooks that you could have used, there wasn't many, there was only 2, wide range of school types and basically league tables. 1 or 2 of you used that increased parental choice has had effects, or used parental choice as a hook. That couldn't be a hook because that's exactly what's written in the question. And like I said in lesson, you cannot use a hook from the item that is the exact or very similar to the question. Okay, so you would have got no credit for that point. So for a wide range of school types, there's a few things you could have talked about, like specialist schools, and what I've tried to do here is explain how I would have connected them to experience of education, but in your essay I'd have expected you to write in more detail than my single bullet points. So yeah, specialist schools, the idea that schools can apply for specialist status and get extra funding, meant that parents can choose schools with subject specialisms that their child enjoys, meaning that the child is more engaged and happy to be there, which is obviously their experience, but again, explain it in more detail. You talked about academies, which meant improved resources because of private funding and support, which improves the experience of education through better teachers, resources, etc. They also don't have to follow the national curriculum, so you could explain why that might affect the experience of the students at that school. You could talk about free schools, and which, just a few things you could say about free schools. One thing I haven't mentioned in that bullet point is a number of them are religious schools, so that might have meant that students felt that they belonged a lot more because they were there with young people who shared similar religious, cultural practices, for example, so they had a stronger sense of belonging and attachment there. Or you could have been more critical of free schools, the fact they take a lot of middle class students compared to free school meal students, who those students therefore might have a much better education, more positive culture around education, more positive pro-school subcultures. They have longer school days and more extracurricular experiences. And again, they also don't have to follow the national curriculum. So you might want to talk about how that would affect their experiences in school. I've written a few evaluation points in there for you as well. So specialist school funding really rarely made much difference to those schools. So if you went to like a performing arts school, it's quite likely that the young person really wouldn't have realised or noticed that it was a performing arts school. You talked about academies corruption, meant that resources are diverted away, so the poor, that ends up into being a poor experience. You could actually do a whole point about that, to be honest with you, as well as just using it as evaluation. And again, free schools and academies, to be honest with you, don't need to employ qualified teachers, which may lead to a negative experience of education, but could also be positive if they get like an industry specialist teaching, I don't know, electronics. That would be useful, for example. League tables, I think most of you did pick out the league tables hook, talking about the effect of cream skimming means that middle class or white students or Asian students, as we've been looking at more recently, more likely to attend these top schools because schools want them, they do covert selection to get them, and as a result they have a much more positive experience of school. It's not enough to just say positive experience of school, you need to explain how. Again, link it to the subcultures, link it to the setting, link it to the quality of teaching because of the resources. You could have done a point on working class students being less able to get into these top schools using the idea of Gerwitz, ending up in poorly performing schools with less funding, resources, poorer teaching, more anti-school subcultures. Again, those are all problems with experiences. And of course, league tables, you should and hopefully did write about the A to C economy, meaning that, for certain students, like working class and some ethnic minority students, they're abandoned in bottom sets, which leads to a poor experience. Whereas the middle class or the CD borderline particularly, they benefit from lots of extra support, so their experience of education is likely to be more positive. Evaluation, you could have used Progress 8, meaning that league tables, schools now focus on the progress of all students. Lots of free schools that have been set up are actually specialist behaviour schools, so they're there to support those working class students. Sorry, I've just realised I put that evaluation point in the wrong section. That one about free schools should be up with a wider range of school types. And it is worth saying that cream skimming is illegal and local authorities do try and prevent schools from doing that so that there is a lot of investigations into schools who perhaps are cream skimming. As I've said before, application, lots of issues with application. Just saying that they would go to a good school or the best school and have a good experience is not enough. Likewise, saying that they'll go to a bad school or a poor school, that's not enough. You had to explain why the experience would be good or bad, okay? Again, a few errors with discussing grammar schools, 11 plus, and comprehensives. These are all pre-parental choice. And just the same as the last 10 marker, if your hook was missing or your application was missing, it becomes a useless point, so I wouldn't have credited it. If the explanation is in no way linked to the hook, again, it's a useless point. So look at my annotations at the end of your 10 marker. Like if I've said any of those things are missing, then that means that point would have not gained you any credit. So I'd have only credited the other point that you did, and if in both points something was missing, the most you could get was 3. So thank you for listening to my feedback. Hopefully you haven't had to listen to all of it. Just like I said, skip back and forward to the questions you want the most help with. Add the improvements, pause the lecture, add the improvements. But yeah, well done guys. It's been a funny old year and you've done pretty well considering, okay? So yeah, we are very grateful for your hard work at the end of the year on your mocks.